I hope you had a good day. So, I'm finally going to be finishing Carmilla. We have made it through almost the entirety of this book. Only took six videos. I'm like sad to be finishing it, but at the same time excited, because that means that we can start a new series, a new reading series. I got in a book called Damnable Tales, a folk horror anthology. I'm like reading off the book because I have it propped up over there. So that'll be its own series. That'll be started at some point. Until then, got a cute little bow in my hair. Thought it was matching the shirt, you know. And long intro out of the way, we're gonna get started. I believe we're picking off at the Woodman. There soon, however, appeared some drawbacks. In the first place, Millarca complained of extreme languor, the weakness that remained after her late illness, and she had never emerged from her room till the afternoon was pretty far advanced. In the next place, it was accidentally discovered, although she always locked her door on the inside and never disturbed the key from its place till she admitted the maid to assist at her toilet, that she was undoubtedly sometimes absent from her room in the very early morning, and at various times later in the day before she wished it to be understood that she was stirring. She was repeatedly seen from the windows of the slosh in the first faint grey of the morning, walking through trees in an easterly direction and looking like a person in a trance. This convinced me that she walked in her sleep, but this hypothesis did not solve the puzzle. How did she pass out from her room, leaving the door locked on the inside? How did she escape from the house without unbarring door or window? In the midst of my perplexities, an anxiety of a far more urgent kind presented itself. My dear child began to lose her looks and health, and that in a manner so mysterious and even horrible that I became thoroughly frightened. She was at first visited by appalling dreams, then, as she fancied, by a spectre, sometimes resembling Millarca, sometimes in the shape of a beast indistinctly seen walking around the foot of her bed from side to side. Lastly came sensations, one not unpleasant, but very peculiar, she said, resembled the flow of an icy stream against her breast. At a later time she felt something like a pair of large needles pierce her a little below the throat with very sharp pain. A few nights after, a gradual and convulsive sense of strangulation, then came unconsciousness. I could hear distinctly every word the kind old general was saying, because by this time we were driving upon the short grass that spreads on either side of the road as you approach the roofless village, which had not shown the smoke of a chimney for more than half a century. You may guess how strangely I felt as I heard my own symptoms so exactly described in those which had been experienced by the poor girl also how I felt as I heard him detail habits and mysterious peculiarities which were in fact those of our beautiful guest, Carmilla. A vista opened in the forest where we were all sudden under the chimneys and gables of the ruined village, and the towers and battlements of the dismantled castle, round which gigantic trees are grouped, overhung us from a slight eminence. In a frightened dream, I got down from the carriage, and in silence, for which we had each abundant matter for thinking, we soon mounted the ascent and were among the spacious chambers, winding stairs, and dark corridors of the castle. And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins, said the old general at length, as from a great window he looked out across the village and saw the wide, undulating expanse of forest. It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written, he continued. It is hard that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts. That is the chapel of Karnsteins down there. He pointed down to the grey walls of the Gothic building, partially visible through the foliage a little way down the steep, and I hear the axe of a woodman, he added, busy among the trees that surround it. He may give us the information of which I am in search, and point out the grave of Marcella, Countess of Karnstein. These rustics preserve the local traditions of great families whose stories die out among the rich and titled, so soon as the families themselves become extinct. We have a portrait at home of Marcella, the Countess Karnstein. Should you like to see it? Asked my father. Time enough, dear friend, replied the general. I believe that I have seen the original, and one motive which has led me to you earlier than I have first intended was to explore the chapel which we are now approaching. What? See the Countess Marcella? Claimed my father. Why, she had been dead more than a century. It's almost like Carmilla looked exactly like her, right down to the birthmarks. Maybe put two and two together. This bitch is insane. But she's hot, so that's not just me saying that. Every character has been like the beautiful Carmilla. Not so dead as you fancy, I am told, answered the general. I confess, General, you puzzle me utterly, replied my father, looking at him. I fancied for a moment, with the return of suspicion I detected before. But although there was anger and detestation, at times in the old general's manner there was nothing flighty. There remains to me, he said, as he passed under the heavy arch of the Gothic church, for its dimensions would have justified its being so styled, but one object which can interest me during the few years that remain to me on earth, and it is to wreak on her the vengeance which I think God may still be accomplished by a mortal arm. What vengeance can you mean? Asked my father in increasing amazement. I mean to decapitate the monster. He answered with a fierce flush and a stamp that echoed mournfully through the hollow ruin, and his clenched hand was at the same moment raised, as if it grasped the handle of an axe, while he shook it ferociously in the air. What? Exclaimed my father, more than ever bewildered. Just strike her head off, he said. Did I stutter? I want to behead that bitch. Cut her head off. I, with a hatchet, with a spade, or with anything that can cleave through her murderous throat. You shall hear, he answered, trembling with rage. And hurrying forward, he said, the beam will answer for a seat, you dear. Child is fatigued. Let her be seated, and I will in a few sentences close my dreadful story. The square block of wood which lay on the grass-grown pavement of the chapel formed a bench on which I am very glad to seat myself, and in the meantime the general called to the woodman, who had been removing some boughs which leaned upon the old walls, and axe in hand. The hardy old fellow stood before us. He could not tell us anything of these monuments, but there was an old man, he said, a ranger of this forest at present sojourning in the house of the priest, about 2 miles away, who could point out every monument of the old Karnstein family, and for we would lend him one of our horses in little more than half an hour. Have you been long employed about this forest? Asked my father of the old man. I could have been a woodman here, he answered in his patios, under the forester, all my days, so has my father before me, and so on as many generations as I can count up. I could show you the very house in the village here in which my ancestors lived. And how come the village to be deserted? Asked the general. It was travelled by revenant sir. Several were tracked to their graves. They're detected by the usual tests and extinguished in the usual way, by decapitation, by the stake, and by burning, but not until many of the villagers were killed. But after all these proceedings, according to law, he continued, so many graves opened and so many vampires deprived of their horrible animation, the village was not relieved. But a Moravian nobleman who happened to be traveling this way heard how matters were, and being skilled, he offered to, and so as many people are in this country in such affairs, he offered to deliver the village from his tormentor. He did so thus. There being a bright moon that night, he ascended shortly after sunset. The towers of the chapel here, from whence he could distinctly see the churchyard beneath him. You can see from the window. From this point he watched until he saw the vampire come out of his grave and place near it the linen clothes in which he had been folded, and then glide away towards the village to plague its inhabitants. The stranger, having seen all this, came down from the steeple, took the linen wrappings of the vampire, and carried them up to the top of the tower, which he again mounted. When the vampire returned from his prowlings and missed his clothes, he cried furiously to the Moravian he saw at the summit of the tower, and who in reply beckoned him to ascend and take them. Whereupon the vampire, accepting his invitation, began to climb the steeple, and so as soon as he had reached the battlements, the Moravian, with a stroke of his sword, clove his skull in twain, hurling him down to the churchyard, whither, descending by the winding stairs, the stranger followed and cut his head off, and the next day delivered it in the bodies of the villagers, who duly impaled and burnt them. This Moravian nobleman had authority from the then head of the family to remove the tomb of Marcella, Countess Karnstein, which did effectually, so that in a little while its site was quite forgotten. Can you point out where he stood? Asked the general eagerly. The forester shook his head and smiled. Not a soul living could tell you that now, he said. Besides, they say her body was removed, but no one is sure of that either. Having thus spoken, as time pressed, he dropped his axe and departed, leaving us to hear the remainder of the general's strange story. Yeah, her body wasn't found because she's alive and thriving. She's slaying literally. My beloved child, he resumed. This is the meeting, by the way, next chapter. Was now growing rapidly worse. The physician who attended her had failed to produce the slightest impression on her disease, for such I then supposed it to be. He saw my alarm and suggested a consultation. I called in a abler physician from Graz. Several days elapsed before he arrived. He was a good, pious, as a learned man. Having seen my poor ward together, they withdrew to my library to confer and discuss. I, from the adjoining room, where I awaited their summons, heard these two gentlemen's voices raised in something sharper than a strictly philosophical discussion. I knocked at the door and entered. I found the old physician from Graz, maintaining his theory. His rival was combating it with undisguised ridicule, accompanied with bursts of laughter. Damn, he really said, that's a joke. This unseemly manifestation subsided and the altercation ended on my entrance. "Sir," said my first physician, "my learned brother seems to think that you are a conjurer and not a doctor." "Pardon me," said the old physician from Graz, looking displeased. "I shall state my own view of the case in my own way another time. I grieve, Monsieur le General, that by my skill in science I can be of no use. Before I go, I shall do myself the honor to suggest something to you," he said thoughtful. He seemed thoughtful and sat down at a table and began to write. Profoundly disappointed, I made my bow, and as I turned to go, the other doctor pointed over his shoulder to his companion who was writing, and then with a shrug significantly touched his forehead. The consultation then left me precisely where I was. I walked out into the grounds, all but distracted. The doctor from Graz in 15 minutes overtook me. He apologized for having followed me, but said that he could not conscientiously take his leave without a few more words. He told me that he could not be mistaken, no natural disease exhibited the same symptoms, and that death was already very near. There remained, however, a day or two possibly of life. If the fatal seizure were at once arrested with great care and skill, her strength might possibly return, but all hung now upon the confines of the irrevocable. One more assault might extinguish the last spark of vitality, which is every moment ready to die. "And what is the nature of the seizure you speak of?" I entreated. "I have stated all fully in this note, which I place in your hands upon the distinct condition that you send for the nearest clergyman and open my letter in his presence, and on no account read it till he is with you. You would despise it else, and it is a matter of life and death. Should the priest fail you, then indeed you may read it." He asked me before taking his leave, finally, whether I would wish to see a man curiously learned upon the very subject which, after I had read his letter, would probably interest me above all others, and he urged me earnestly to invite him to visit him there, and so took his leave. The ecclesiastic was absent, and I read the letter by myself. At another time, or in another case, it might have excited my ridicule, but into what quackeries will not rush people for a chance, where all accused means have failed, and the life of a beloved object is at stake? Nothing, you will say, could be more absurd than the learned man's letter. It was monstrous enough to have consigned him to a madhouse. He said that the patient was suffering from the visits of a vampire. The punctures, which he described as having occurred near the throat, were, he insisted, the insertions of 2 long, thin, and sharp teeth, which there could be no doubt, he added, as well, defined presence of the small livid mark, which all concurred in describing as that induced by the demon's lips, and every symptom described by the sufferer was in exact conformity with those recorded in every case of a similar visitation. Being myself wholly skeptical as to the existence of any such portent as the vampire, the supernatural theory of a good doctor furnished, in my opinion, but another instance of learning and intelligence, all associated with some one hallucination. I was so miserable, however, that rather than trying nothing, I acted upon the instructions of the letter. I concealed myself in the dark dressing room that opened upon the poor patient's room, in which a candle was burning, and watched there till she was fast asleep. I stood at the door, peeping through the small crevice, my sword laid onto the table beside me, as my directions prescribed, until a little after 1 I saw a large black object, very ill-defined, crawl, as it seemed to me, over the foot of the bed, and swiftly spread itself up to the poor girl's throat, where it swelled in a moment into a great palpitating mass. For a few moments I stood petrified, and now sprang forward with my sword in my hand. The black creature suddenly contracted toward the foot of the bed, gliding over it, and standing on the floor about a yard below the foot of the bed, with a glare of skulking ferocity and horror fixed on me. I saw Millarca. Speculating I know not what, I struck at her insistently with my sword, but I saw her standing near the door unscathed. Horrified, I pursued and struck again. She was gone, and my sword flew to shivers against the door. I can't describe to you all that passed on that horrible night. The whole house was up and stirring. The spectre Millarca was gone, but her victim was sinking fast, and before the morning dawned, she died. The old general was agitated. We did not speak to him. My father walked to some distance and began reading the inscriptions on the tombstones, and thus occupied, he strolled into the door of a side chapel to prosecute his researches. The general leaned against the wall, dried his eyes, and sighed heavily. I was relieved on hearing the voices of Carmilla and Madame, who were at the moment approaching. The voices died away. In this solitude, having just listened to so strange a story, connected as it was with the great entitled dead, whose monuments, as it were, with the great entitled dead. Why did I repeat that? Whose monuments were molding among the dust and ivy round us, and every incident of which borne so awfully upon my own mysterious case, in this haunted spot, darkened by the towering foliage that rose on every side, dense and high above its noiseless walls, a horror began to steal over me, and my heart sank, as I thought that my friends were after all not about to enter and disturb this triste and ominous scene. The old general's eyes were fixed on the ground as he leaned with his hand upon the basement of a shattered monument, under a narrow arched doorway, surmounted by one of those demoniacal grotesques in which the cynical and ghastly fancy of old Gothic carving delights. I saw very gladly the beautiful face and figure of Carmilla enter the shadowy chapel. I was just about to rise and speak, and nodded smiling in answer to her peculiarly engaging smile, when with a cry the old man by my side caught up the woodman's hatchet and started forward. On seeing him, a brutalized change came over her features. It was an instantaneous and horrible transformation, as she made a crouching step backwards. Before I could utter a scream, he struck at her with all his force, but she dived under his blow and, unscathed, caught him in her tiny grasp by the wrist. He struggled for a moment to release his arm, but his hand opened. The axe fell to the ground, and the girl was gone. He staggered against the wall. His gray hair stood up upon his head, and moisture shone over his face, as if he were at the point of death. The frightful scene had passed in a moment. The first thing I recollect after is Madame standing before me and impatiently repeating again and again the question, "Where is Mademoiselle Carmilla?" I answered at length, "I don't know. I can't tell. She went there." And I pointed to the door through which Madame had entered only a minute or two since, but I had been standing there in the passage ever since Mademoiselle entered, and she did not return. She then began to call Carmilla through every door and passage and from the windows, but no answer came. She called herself Carmilla, as the general, still agitated. "Carmilla, yes," I answered. He said, "that is Millarca. That is the same person who long ago was called Millarca, Countess Karnstein. Depart from this accursed ground, my poor child, as quickly as you can. Drive to the clergyman's house and stay there till we come. Begone, maybe you never behold Carmilla more. You will not find her here." Damn, really? I was wondering if, someone who had seen her before would see her again, and they did. I'm, surprised that she used Millarca before, too, because, she changed her name to Carmilla, when she met Laura and them, so it's why did she change her name before? I would assume she's been doing this for, a century, right? So, wouldn't you have, a lot of different names? I would think she'd have even more, aliases, you know what I mean? Besides just Carmilla. I think this is the final chapter, Ordeal and Execution. As he spoke, one of the strangest looking men I had ever beheld entered the chapel, the door through which Carmilla had made her entrance and her exit. He was tall, narrow-chested, stooping, with high shoulders, and dressed in black. His face was brown and dried in with deep furrows. He wore an oddly shaped hat with a broad leaf. His hair, long and grizzled, hung on his shoulders. He wore a pair of gold spectacles and walked slowly with an odd, shambling gait, with his face sometimes turned up to the sky and sometimes bowed down towards the ground. Seemed to wear a perpetual smile. His long, thin arms were swinging, and his lank hands in old black gloves, ever so much too wide for them, waving and gestating in utter abstraction. "That very man," exclaimed the general, advanced with manifest delight. My dear Baron, how happy I am to see you. I had no hope of meeting you so soon." He sighed to my father, who had by this time returned, and leading the fantastic old gentleman whom he called the Baron to meet him. He introduced him formally, and they at once entered the earnest conversation. The stranger took a roll of paper from his pocket and spread it on the worn surface of a tomb that stood by. He had a pencil case in his which she traced imaginary lines from point to point on the paper, which from their often glancing from it together at certain points of the building I concluded to be a plan of the chapel. He accompanied which I may term his lecture with occasional readings from a dirty little book whose yellow leaves were closely written over. They sauntered together down the side aisle, opposite to the spot where I was standing, conversing as they went. Then they began measuring distances by paces, and finally they all stood together facing a piece of the sidewall, which they began to examine with great minuteness, pulling off the ivy that clung over it and rapping the plaster with the ends of their sticks, scraping here and knocking there. At length they asserted the existence of a broad marble tablet with letters carved in relief upon it. With the assistance of the woodman who soon returned, a monumental inscription and carved echelon were disclosed. They proved to be those of the long-lost monument of Morgana, Countess Karnstein. The old general, though not, I fear, given to the praying mood, raised his hands and eyes to heaven in mute thanksgivings for some moments. Tomorrow, I heard him say, the commissioner will be here, and the inquisition will be held according to law. Then returning to the old man with the gold spectacles whom I have described, he shook him warmly by both hands and said, Baron, how can I thank you? How can we all thank you? You have delivered this region from a plague that has scourged its inhabitants for more than a century. The horrible enemy, thank God, is at last tracked. My father led the stranger aside, and the general followed. I know that he had let them out of hearing, that he might relate to my case, and I saw them glance often quickly at me, and the discussion proceeded. My father came to me, kissed me again and again, and leading me from the chapel said, It is time to return, but before we go home we must add to our party the good priest, who lives but a little way from us, and persuade him to accompany us to the Schloss. In this quest we were successful, and I was glad, being unspeakably fatigued when we reached home. But my satisfaction was changed to dismay on discovering that there were no tidings of Carmilla. Of the scene that had occurred in the ruined chapel, no explanation was offered to me, and it was clear that it was a secret which my father for the present determined to keep from me. The sinister absence of Carmilla made the remembrance of the scene more horrible to me. The arrangements for the night were singular. 2 servants and Madame were set up in my room that night, and the ecclesiastic, with my father, kept watch in the adjoining dressing room. The priest had performed certain solemn rites that night, the purport of which I did not understand any more than I comprehended the reason of this extraordinary precaution taken for my safety during sleep. I saw all clearly a few days later. The disappearance of Carmilla was followed by the discontinuance of my nightly sufferings. You have heard, no doubt, of the appalling superstition that prevails in Upper and Lower Styria, in Moravia, Cilicia, in Turkish Serbia, in Poland, even in Russia. The superstition, so I must call it, of the vampire. If human testimony taken with every care and solemnity, judicially before commissions innumerable, each consisting of many members, all chosen for integrity and intelligence, and constituting reports more voluminous perhaps than exist upon any one other class of cases, is worth anything. It is difficult to deny or even to doubt the existence of such a phenomenon as the vampire. For my part, I have heard no theory by which to explain which I myself have witnessed and experienced, other than that supplied by the ancient and well-attested belief of the country. The next day the formal proceedings took place in the chapel of Karnstein. The grave of the Countess Morgana was open, and the general and my father recognized each his perfidious and beautiful guest in the face now disclosed to view. The features, though 150 years had passed since her funeral, were tinted with the warmth of life. Her eyes were open, no cadaverous smell exhaled from the coffin. The 2 medical men, one officially present, the other on the part of the promoter of the inquiry, attested the marvelous fact that there was a faint but appreciable respiration and corresponding action of the heart. The limbs were perfectly flexible, the flesh elastic, and the leaden coffin floated with blood in which to depth of 7 inches the body lay immersed. Here then were all the admitted signs and proofs of vampirism. The body, therefore, in accordance with the ancient practice, was raised gaze and a sharp stake driven through the heart of the vampire, who uttered a piercing shriek at that moment. In all respects such as might escape from a living person in the last agony. Then the head was struck off, and a torrent of blood flowed from the severed neck. The body and head were next placed on a pile of wood and reduced to ashes, which were thrown upon the river and borne away, and that territory has never since been plagued by the visits of a vampire. My father has a copy of the report of the Imperial Commission, with the signatures of all those who were present at these proceedings, attached in verification of the statement. It is from this official paper that I have summarized my account of this last shocking scene. Oh, there's more. The conclusion. I write all of this, you suppose, with composure, but far from it. I cannot think of it without agitation. Nothing but your earnest desire, so repeatedly expressed, could have induced me to sit down to a task that has unstruck my nerves for months to come, and reintroduced a shadow of the unspeakable horror which years after my deliverance continued to make my days and nights dreadful, and solitude insupportably terrific. Let me add a word or two about that quaint Baron Vordenberg, to whose curious lore we were indebted for the discovery of the Countess Markala's grave. He had taken his abode in Graz, where living upon a mere pittance, which was all that remained to him of that once princely estates of his family. In Upper Styria he devoted himself to the minute and laborious investigation of the marvelously authenticated tradition of vampirism. He had at his fingers' ends all the great and little works upon the subject. Magia Postuma, these are all in a different language, De Mirabilibus Augustinus de Cura Promordius, Philosophica et Christianae Cogentius de Vampiris, by John Christopher Herenberg, and 1,000 others, among which I remember only a few of those which he lent to my father. He had a voluminous digest of all the judicial cases from which he had extracted a system of principles that appeared to govern, some always and others occasionally only, the condition of the vampire. I may mention in passing that the deadly pallor attributed to the sort of revenants is a mere melodramatic fiction. They present in the grave, and when they show themselves in human society, the appearance of healthy life. When disclosed to light in their coffins, they exhibit all the symptoms that are enumerated as those which prove the vampire life of the long-dead Countess Karnstein. How they escape from their graves and return to them for certain hours every day, without displacing the clay or leaving any trace of disturbance in the state of the coffin or their cerements, has always been admitted to be utterly inexplicable. Oh! They escape from their graves and return to them for certain hours every day? I was wondering, I was like, how the fuck, why would she even go back to her coffin? Like, wouldn't you be like, oh, they know I'm a vampire, they're gonna come for me, you know? Like, why would you ever return to your coffin? But this is like making it sound like they have to for certain times of the day. Is that like midnight? But then does it make sense? I would think vampires would be nocturnal, you know? Right? But then that makes sense, because earlier they were talking about like checking Carmilla's room and her just being gone. So I'm assuming she like somehow made it back. Like, did she fly? Did she teleport? How far was she? Like, cars did not exist. Like, sis couldn't just like drive to her grave, you know? That's so weird. The amphibious existence of the vampire is sustained by daily renewed slumber in the grave. Its horrible lust for living blood supplies the vigor of its waking existence. The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence, resembling the passion of love by particular persons. In pursuit of these, it will exercise inexhaustible patience and stare again, for access to a particular object may be obstructed in 100 ways. It will never desist until it has satiated its passion and drained the very life of its coveted victim. But it will, in these cases, husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten it by gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. In ordinary ones, it goes direct to its object, overpowers with violence, and strangles and exhausts, often at a single feast. Yeah, right. is apparently subject in certain situations to special conditions. In the particular instance of which I have given you a relation, Marcella seemed to be limited to a name which, if not real one, should at least produce, without the omission or addition of a single letter, those, as we say, anagrammatically which compose it. I see, so like her victim had to know her by her name. That's why she had to do an anagram. Okay, I see. So it does kind of limit her. There's only so many names that she could use with all the same letters. Okay, that's interesting. And now it's saying there's like different types. So some vampires will just straight up attack you in the night and just completely drain you in like one feast. But then there's these special cases where they're like want to bond with you and they'll slowly drain you. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Okay, let's see what else. Carmilla did this, so did Malarca. My father related to the Baron Vordenberg, who remained with us for 2 or 3 weeks after the expulsion of Carmilla, the story about the Moravian nobleman and the vampire at Karnstein churchyard, and then he asked the Baron how he had discovered the exact position of the long-concealed tomb of the Countess Marcella. The Baron's grotesque features puckered up into a mysterious smile. He looked down, still smiling on his worn spectacle case, and fumbled with it. Then looking up, he said, "I have many journals and other papers written by that remarkable man. The most curious among them is one treating of the visit of which you speak to Karnstein. The tradition, of course, discolors and distorts a little. He might have been termed a Moravian nobleman, for he had changed his abode to that territory, and was besides a noble. But he was in truth a native of Upper Styria. It is enough to say that in very early youth he had been a passionate and favorite lover of the beautiful Marcella, Countess Karnstein. Her early death plunged him into inconsolable grief. It is the nature of vampires to increase and multiply, but according to an ascertained and ghostly law. Assume at starting a territory perfectly free from that pest. How does it begin and how does it multiply itself? I will tell you. A person more or less wicked puts an end to himself. A suicide under certain circumstances becomes a vampire. The spectator visits living people in their slumbers. They die and almost invariably in the grave develop into vampires. This happened in the case of beautiful Marcella, who was haunted by one of those demons. My ancestor Vordenberg, whose title I still bear, was soon discovered this, and in the course of the studies to which he devoted himself, learned a great deal more. Among other things, he concluded that suspicion of vampirism would probably fall sooner or later upon the dead countess, who in life had been his idol. He conceived a horror by what she might of her remains being profaned by the outrage of a posthumous execution. He has left a curious paper to prove that the vampire, on its expulsion from its amphibious existence, is projected into a far more horrible life, and resolved to save his once beloved Marcella from this. He adopted this stratagem of a journey here, a pretended removal of her remains, and a real obliteration of her monument. When age had stolen upon him, and from the veil of years he looked back on the scenes he was leaving, he considered in a different spirit what he had done, and a horror took possession of him. He made the tracings and notes which have guided me to the very spot, and drew up a confession of the deception that he had practiced. If he had intended any further action in this matter, death prevented him, and the hand of a remote descendant has, too late for many, directed the pursuit to the lair of the beast. We talked a little more, and among other things he said was this. One sign of the vampire is the power of the hand. The slender hand of Marcella closed like a vice of steel on the general's wrist when he raised the hatchet to strike, but its power is not confined to its grasp. It leaves a numbness in the limb. It seizes, which is slowly, if ever, recovered from. The following spring my father took me on a tour through Italy. It remained for more than a year. It was long before the terror of recent events subsided, and to this hour the image of Carmilla returns to memory with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, beautiful girl, sometimes the writhing fiend I saw in a ruined church, and often from a reverie I have started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing-room door. Dang. And that's the end of Carmilla. Damn, so they really got the jump on her while she was in her grave. just straight up wait until they're like asleep and then get the, element of surprise on them. That reminds me of, I actually just finished a D&D campaign with my friends, and we were doing the Curse of Strahd, and I remember one of our sessions, at one part there was like a room full of vampires, and they were all like, in their coffins, and we got the jump on them. Pretty much killed them all almost like immediately, to be honest. I can't remember if one of my friends had like a stun attack, but I think we pretty much killed all of them. There's only like a couple left that we kind of had to, but they were still like shocked because I think these were all moves that we did pretty like back to back. But yeah, I guess that seems to be like their weakness, besides like getting staked. Well, that's how you kill them, you stake them. I didn't hurt the beheading